attend this briefing. My name is Maria Korsnick, and I am President and Chief Executive Officer of the Nuclear Energy Institute. I replaced Marv Fertel, and he retired after many excellent years of service to NEI at the end of last year. So I've met some of you, and I hope to meet many more of you in the months coming ahead. I look very much forward to continuing NEI's relationship with you in providing you very accurate information, objective and well reasoned. Since this is my first briefing for you, I thought what I'd do is tell you a little bit about myself and my background. My first job out of college was as a nuclear engineer at, don't tell me they're showing you a picture of me. My first job was as a nuclear engineer at the Calvert Cliffs nuclear plant in southern Maryland, where I worked for 17 years. I was a senior reactor operator there at Calvert. I later became the site vice president of the YANKEE power plant here in New York. I was also a corporate vice president for operations in our headquarters in Baltimore, Maryland, and later the chief nuclear officer for the Constellation Energy Nuclear Group fleet. And before coming to NEI in 2015, I was the senior vice president of operations in the Northeast for Exelon. So I'm an operations person through and through. I'm very familiar with how you operate these nuclear plants, as well as the importance of operating a reliable electric grid. And you're also going to learn that I'm very passionate about nuclear energy. I've been in the nuclear energy field now for 30 years. I'm convinced that nuclear energy, by any objective measure, represents the most complete value proposition of all sources of electricity. Nuclear energy is essential to a robust, sustainable electric system, one that will continue to deliver reliable, affordable electricity while meeting our environmental policy goals. Our nuclear plants drive regional economics by providing hundreds of well-paying jobs. I firmly believe that the United States is the global leader in nuclear energy today, and that we must continue to embrace that leadership role. The U.S. has the largest fleet of nuclear plants today, and our Nuclear Regulatory Commission is viewed as the global leader for ensuring safety. This leadership is predicated on having a strong nuclear industry that is, in fact, building for the future. In my time with you today, I'd like to lay out our vision for nuclear energy and provide an assessment for the key issues that are facing us today. This vision begins with the vital role that nuclear power plays today in the electric system and of the electric system of the future. I will discuss actions that have taken place in New York as well as in Illinois and as part of a broader policy landscape. And I'll also highlight some key numbers that define the state of the industry today. And finally, I will conclude by discussing the critical role of the U.S. nuclear leadership, and then I'll take your questions. I also wanted to make note that we will have some handouts for you at the conclusion of the Q&A session today, and also the remarks that I'm making here will be posted at nei.org. Let's start by looking at our operating nuclear plants. They're the backbone of the U.S. electric system and a critical part of our national infrastructure. Think for just a moment about the essential services that they provide. Nuclear plants run nearly all the time, impervious to weather conditions, like the weather conditions that we're experiencing today. Uncertainty or interruptibility in the fuel supply is really a non-issue for the nuclear plants. Unlike some others, say gas or renewables or coal, the cost of electricity from a nuclear plant is affordable and stable. Due to uranium's extraordinarily high energy content and stable prices, nuclear electricity has very little price volatility, making it a valuable part of an energy portfolio. Nuclear plants are tremendous economic engines. Collectively, the nuclear industry contributes about $60 billion a year to the U.S. economy. The nuclear fleet supports 475,000 jobs, and we produce $12 billion in tax revenue, both federal and state, each year. Over its entire lifetime, a single 2-unit plant creates the equivalent of 1,000 jobs for 60 years. Nuclear plants provide a unique combination of large capacity, dispatchable generation, and enormous clean air compliance value. Nuclear plants do not emit pollutants such as carbon, sulfur, or nitrous oxides. There's been independent studies completed, and they estimate that the value of avoiding these emissions at roughly $33 billion every year. Now, these are long-lived assets operating for 60 to 80 years. The new plants now under construction in Georgia and South Carolina, they're going to still be operating in 2080 or quite possibly at the end of this century. Nuclear power is a critical part of our national energy infrastructure. It provides sustained economic benefits to the entire economy. It plays a key role in assuring grid reliability, and it's by far the largest source of clean air energy. When a nuclear plant closes because the markets do not fully value the services that they provide, the negative economic consequences of these shutdowns really cascade. In many areas, the local nuclear power plant is the economic anchor of the community. These shutdowns are painful not only for the nuclear plant workers, but for the communities as well. I experienced this firsthand when I was the site vice president of the Ginna plant. And this was several years ago, and I looked ahead and based on the marketplace said I could foresee a time when we needed to shut down the Ginna plant. And I met with the local town mayors, with the school superintendent, and I explained to them the situation that the market was placing us in. And you need to understand this plant had been operating for over 40 years, went into service in 1969. And they looked at me, the air going out of the room, and said, Maria, you are the school system. You are the reasons we have the roads and the conditions that we do today. We are completely dependent on the tax base of this large infrastructure that's part of our community. And so again, I can appreciate firsthand the significance and the value that these plants bring to the local community. And you're going to see those same impacts play out over the next few years in the wake of announcements that 5 nuclear plants will be closing, including the one here in New York, Indian Point. The financial community and power companies are often focused on immediate challenges and opportunities. NEI is working hand in hand with the companies that are operating our nuclear plants to address these challenges. We're focused on ensuring that their economic value is in fact fully recognized and that they enjoy an efficient and risk-informed, safety-focused regulatory environment. But we can't allow the short-term priorities to consume all of our attention and resources. Let's step back for just a minute and let's think 25 to say 30 years from now. And I know on one hand that sounds like it's a long time, but it's really a blink of an eye if you think about planning for our electric infrastructure. We expect a lot from our power system. Well, we want low cost, that's always important. We need our plants to be flexible. We want them to adapt to a very changing demand. Oh, you still want some of that excess capacity in case the system gets stressed. And you want dispatchable generation, so it can step up when some of the intermittent sources fall. We want fuel diversity in order for our energy security and to prevent price swings. And we want to make sure that this is done while protecting our clean air, clean water. Doing all of this exactly right requires thinking decades ahead in terms of both policy and technology. Nuclear power will play a vital role in meeting those needs. Within 25 to 30 years, The U.S. electric grid will take a range of reactor types, and they'll expand the roles for nuclear energy in the economy. These designs are in fact the outgrowth of decades of continuous innovation. It's combined with scientists and entrepreneurs, Bill Gates as an example, who see a new generation of nuclear technology. Let's think about that grid of the future. It's going to include a growing role for intermittent renewable energy. So the nuclear reactors of the future will actually accommodate that very nicely. Some will make electricity around the clock. Others are going to produce electricity when we need it, and they're going to produce other things when that electricity is rather supplied by other sources. Some will supply the transportation market. Nuclear electricity can charge batteries, and nuclear process heat will make alternative fuels. Some reactors will make fresh water, and some will drive industrial production. Some reactors might even produce energy from today's used fuel, reducing our disposal burden. The runway to that future is a continuum of development and innovation. The journey starts by preserving America's existing nuclear plants today. Almost all of the reactors in the United States have received a renewed license to operate for 60 years. The industry is working to enable additional license renewals that will allow them to safely operate even longer. The knowledge and expertise gained and developed in support of today's fleet will be the base that we need to develop these new technologies. In fact, we see this now. We have 4 reactors that are under construction in Georgia and South Carolina. These designs use passive safety approaches to advance the state-of-the-art in nuclear technology, and the approach was informed, in fact, by decades of experience and innovation. Beyond the 4 that are being built, nuclear plant owners have already received construction operating licenses for 7 additional reactors, and 3 more, in fact, are being evaluated at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. These licenses provide valuable options as companies look to the future. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, will be ready in the early to mid-2020s. These are designs that use their smaller size, in fact, to maximize safety and rethink how nuclear plants can be configured. They will offer flexibility in deployment and operation. Last month, in fact, NuScale became the first company to apply for an SMR design certification from the NRC. The industry also is pressing ahead with the development and deployment of advanced non-light water reactors in the 2030s. So this is truly a journey, and each step is important. Industry and government must play the short game and the long game with equal energy and commitment. Allowing existing nuclear plants to close prematurely will compromise America's ability to develop a sustainable electric sector. Premature closures will cause significant economic damage, the loss of expertise, and erosion of the commercial infrastructure, and it will severely limit the ability to develop that grid of the future. A promising future creates a compelling rationale for tackling the challenges that we have for the present. With the vision of that long term in our mind, let me now give you a view of the policy landscape. I believe we're reaching a tipping point as policymakers have really come to appreciate the risk of losing their nuclear plants. We have come a long way in a relatively short period of time. As I think back to, say, September of 2013, NEI's senior management at that time met with senior management officials at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as well as the Department of Energy. They wanted to make sure that they understood the challenges that were facing our operating plants. Recall now, at that time, Kewaunee, the plant in Wisconsin, had just closed, and the Vermont YANKEE plant was scheduled to close at the end of 2014. At that time, we told DOE and FERC just how many others, in fact, were at risk. thanks to low growth in electricity demand, low natural gas prices, state and federal policies that promoted other generation, transmission constraints, and other factors. This was actually a surprise to many, and a particular typical response from a FERC commissioner: I had no idea. I thought it would always be 20% of our US electricity supply. I guess I was taking it for granted. So since then, companies have either shut down or announced the shutdown of 7 additional reactors. And as you know well, others are at risk. However, I do believe that the tide is turning. The federal government, the regional transmission operators, and the states are all recognizing the problem, and we're moving to reform in the competitive markets where, in fact, the greatest risk exists. First, the FERC is taking actions to support reform to the capacity markets and the energy markets. Accurate price formation in the energy markets is particularly important because at a nuclear plant, they get the majority of their revenue from the energy market. Now, while we don't think those changes are going to solve the problem, they will, in fact, be a part of the solution. Second, several of the regional transmission operators, including ISO New England and PJM, recognize the challenges occurring in the energy markets due to requirements imposed by federal and state policies. Organized markets are facing the need to reconcile these state policies to address environmental and price stability needs, with the economic signals coming, in fact, from the market. So, for example, recognizing that the New England states have developed a patchwork of state mandates, the New England Power Pool is taking a closer look at these issues. Stakeholders in those regions are exploring how they could achieve these environmental policy goals through the wholesale markets. Designing markets that can consistently value important aspects of our infrastructure will lead to better decisions in the long term. It's too soon to tell if these processes will lead to near-term changes, but they are clear signals that the markets will need to evolve to meet this changing landscape. While federal and market policymakers have begun working through these complex issues, states have actually taken the lead in acting to preserve our nuclear generation. NEI is working with our members and industry coalitions in the states to increase the appreciation among the policymakers and the public for the critical value of these existing nuclear plants. Over the past year, for example, we've seen 2 very extraordinary and precedent-setting accomplishments when both New York and Illinois adopted policies that help level the playing field for nuclear energy. These policies ensure continued operation of several nuclear plants that otherwise would have closed. The zero emission credits contained in the New York and Illinois policies demonstrate that the states, in fact, do recognize the monetary value of the different attributes of nuclear power. In New York, we supported efforts by labor allies and advocacy groups to put in place a clean energy standard. This preserved the upstate nuclear plants. The plants will receive zero emission credits, recognizing the clean air attributes of the energy that they produce. So that means the Ginna, the Fitzpatrick, and 9 Mile Point plants will be able to continue operating due to these credits. By keeping these plants open, the program will save New York consumers over $1 billion each year through lower electricity prices. In Illinois, NEI teamed with power companies, businesses, and labor groups to achieve the passage of the Future Energy Jobs Bill. In that case, the legislation recognizes the value of nuclear energy to the state's clean air goals by introducing zero emission standard. This law will allow the Clinton and Quad Cities plants to avoid closure and to preserve the more than 4,000 jobs that support them. New York and Illinois serve as examples now to other states that can effectively put solutions in place in these competitive markets. The nuclear industry is sharpening the focus of its advocacy efforts in other states where major policy opportunities also exist. The Connecticut legislature is expected to consider a clean energy procurement process that would include nuclear energy, placing it on even footing with other non-emitting sources. Policy opportunities are also emerging in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, and in New Jersey. The best solutions will be ones that reflect the needs and opportunities of each state and region. We are painfully aware the serious challenges that are facing us, the forces that are putting pressure on the competitive generation sector are taking their toll on the nuclear fleet. But in 2016, it also is when we began to see the ocean liner begin to change its bearing. We see states and regions and the federal government taking actions to preserve our nuclear power plants. The industry was able to work with stakeholders to preserve 5 nuclear plants that would otherwise have been shut down. And we will continue working to find policy solutions that allow these plants to remain a part of our critical electric infrastructure. Now let's move away from the policy world for a bit and highlight some key numbers that help us characterize the state of the industry today. 90%. Collectively, the nuclear fleet achieved an average capacity factor in excess of 90%, as it has for over 15 years. The availability and reliability implied by a 90% capacity factor reflects the sustained level of operational excellence from our fleet today. The capacity factor also represents the critical role that nuclear power plays in providing stable baseload power that's so essential to grid reliability. $6.3 billion. The nuclear industry collectively invested $6.3 billion in 2015 to adopt new technologies, to enhance power plant operations, to increase equipment reliability, and to expand our technical training. Now, we're going to see the 2016 data here in a few weeks, but as you can see, the nuclear industry is consistently making the investments that are necessary that allow the fleet to operate to 60 years and beyond. $650 million. NEI introduced the Delivering the Nuclear Promise program, in fact, last year at this briefing. This industry-wide effort to seek greater efficiency in our plant operation has already identified $650 million in potential savings. Over 1,000 staff across the United States have collaborated to develop efficiency bulletins, and 46 efficiency bulletins, in fact, were created last year. These are targeting improvements in all aspects of operations. To date, over 95% of these bulletins have in fact been implemented, again reflecting the commitment to continuous improvement. And we're just getting started. 19.5%. Nuclear energy continues to supply more than 19% of electricity in the United States. The long lifetime of nuclear plants provides a bridge to the future, as shorter-lived assets age and must be replaced. Failing this, the United States will face a massive replacement of over half of the United States generation capacity by mid-century. The loss of our nuclear plants will have economic impacts as well. Earlier, I mentioned from the nuclear industry contributes over $60 billion each year across the U.S. economy. However, when plants close, those losses are really very much concentrated right there in local communities and regions, and it has dramatic consequences. I'd like to focus now on the closure of the Vermont Yankee and how it's being felt in that region. $493 million. This relatively small nuclear plant was an economic engine for southern Vermont. It created $493 million in economic activity every year. Vernon is a town of 1,200 whose economic welfare depended on the plant and its employees. As the plant ceased operations and began winding down those activities, the impacts were felt beyond the economy. A former elected official in Vernon described the sense of loss to the community. Plant employees, in fact, were deeply involved in all parts of civic life, such as the schools and volunteer fire department. Charitable organizations aren't sure how, in fact, they're going to be able to serve those in need, and without the donations that they typically would get from the plant employees. Housing prices in the area fell 25%. If more and larger plants are closed, these are the kinds of impacts that will be repeated in other communities. Devastating impacts like those drive, in fact, our efforts to prevent early closures of plants and simultaneously focus on building for the future. 5,500 megawatts. By 2021, the United States will have added 5,500 megawatts of new clean air nuclear capacity. Watts Bar Unit 2, already online, came online last October. While the new units at the Vogel and Summer sites continue to drive towards completion, combined, this added capacity will equate to 44 million megawatt hours of electricity every year. Now, this is equivalent to the generation from 25 typical combined cycle natural gas plants, and it's more than all of the US solar generation in 2015. So these new units will deliver economic, environmental, and grid security well in excess as you go forward of the investment. And note that many of the insights gained in building and licensing these units are also going to apply to the reactors of the future, whether that be the small modular reactors or the advanced non-light water reactors. The nuclear industry has the performance, the capability, and is making the necessary investment to sustain and expand the nuclear fleet. This presents our government and investors the opportunity to ensure a sustainable energy infrastructure for the long-term future. When it's difficult to make predictions about this current administration, the Trump administration being in its early days, it does seem clear that his priorities include improving our infrastructure and creating jobs. Nuclear energy will serve these priorities, in fact, very well. Now, we do need to address infrastructure. Every year, the World Economic Forum publishes a global competitiveness report, ranking the world's 138 economies. In the 2016 report, the United States ranked 3rd overall. But if you measured us by our infrastructure, the United States, the world's largest economy and most powerful nation, well, we ranked 11th. Even worse, the quality of the electricity supply in the United States was ranked 17th. The American Society of Civil Engineers' most recent report card gives the U.S. energy infrastructure a D+ grade. Large parts of our electric power infrastructure are in fact in solid shape. Capital investment has increased steadily over the last 15 years, from approximately $40 billion a year in the early 2000s to about $100 billion a year today. But most of this has gone to transmission, distribution, natural gas, and renewables. The part of America's electricity infrastructure in urgent need of attention is the baseload plants, replacing and building these baseload plants that form the backbone of our American electric grid. The nuclear and coal-fired fleets represent more than half of the United States electricity supply. They play a key role in grid stability, and they stabilize electricity prices, acting as an essential hedge against price volatility and supply interruption. By 2040, half of the nation's nuclear fleet will in fact have turned 60. The existing fleet provides a platform to invest in new technology, But we must take a look at that investment before it's too late. So in fact, we face two challenges. First, preserving as much of the baseload infrastructure as possible, which includes our existing nuclear capacity. And second, creating the policy conditions under which companies will develop and build the new nuclear technologies for the nation that we will need in the 2020s, 2030s, and beyond. This is the investment gap in the U.S. electric infrastructure that the federal and state policymakers must address. I've already discussed what we're doing to preserve our existing nuclear plants. Let's discuss the new nuclear build. It may seem strange, in fact, to think about the construction of more nuclear plants at a time of low natural gas prices and slow load growth. But like other major infrastructure investments, it's very critical that you anticipate the gaps with long-term planning and early investment. It's difficult to imagine an energy infrastructure project that produces more jobs and economic benefits than construction of a new nuclear plant. Let's consider the 4 that are under construction today. They're being built at the Vogtle site in Georgia and the VC Summer site in South Carolina. They are due to start operating here in a few years and are now more than halfway through their construction. They employ a workforce of approximately 3,500, not including the tens of thousands of indirect jobs that are created to support the projects and their workforce. These new units will ultimately each employ 700 to 1,000 workers who will operate these plants for 60 to 80 years. These projects are likely the largest infrastructure projects in those 2 states. In fact, when Vogtle and Summer are completed is precisely the time for companies to move forward with additional units. The detailed design and engineering of the AP1000 at Vogtle and Summer will improve cost and schedule certainty for future projects. The lessons learned from these 2 projects can be applied to new ones, both in the regulatory learning and the construction and startup activities. So let's just give an example of where, in fact, we're already seeing that this learning is taking place. In the design of the AP1000, it includes large modules that need to be fabricated and then carefully placed in service with very great precision. One of those modules is called the CA20 module. It's a very large module, over 1,000 pounds. It took over 15 hours to place it in position for Vogtle 3, and that same task took less than an hour for Unit 4. So opportunities for cost efficiency in building these new plants exist through not only standardization, but as well financing approaches. We think that this work can be done, in fact, know that it can be done, because we've seen it happen elsewhere. Using a single reactor design and building at a steady pace, South Korea was able to reduce their construction durations from 64 months to 52 months over the course of a decade. Faster, more efficient construction, in fact, translated into lower cost, about 30% lower. I cannot think of a reason that we would not do the same thing here in the United States. Innovative financing and ownership structures will also reduce cost. The major challenge for a new reactor project is scale. These are large capital investments on the order of $7 billion for a new reactor being built by relatively small companies. New nuclear projects require financing support to help manage that risk. The Federal Loan Guarantee Program, authorized as part of the 2005 Energy Policy Act, is an essential financing technique. Loan guarantees allow employment of higher leverage in the project's capital structure and a broader range of financing structures. Like other major elements, our national infrastructure nuclear plants provide tremendous and far-reaching benefits for nearly a century. Let me conclude with a few thoughts about nuclear energy and America's global leadership. In the world's future, nuclear energy will clearly play a very important role. The 2016 World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency forecasts an 80% increase in electricity generation from nuclear power worldwide by 2040. If you look at a more aggressive scenario for decarbonization, that nuclear output increases 140% by 2040. In order to retain its position as a world leader, America must lead this transition towards increased nuclear generation, not follow it. Yet, while the US brought the world into the nuclear age and our companies dominated nuclear trade, in fact, for decades, today it's the Chinese and the Russians that are way ahead in the global nuclear marketplace. Nearly 2/3 of the plants that are being constructed in the world today use Chinese and Russian designs. For the past 2 decades or more, Russia and China have pursued long-term strategies to develop their robust domestic program as well as to export that nuclear technology. These countries understand very well the leverage that comes from supplying energy and are aggressively using the supply of nuclear energy technology to strengthen their hands in Eastern Europe, in Asia, and in the Middle East. Unfortunately, the United States has not viewed the nuclear industry strategically and has not responded effectively to the threat posed by these other countries and their efforts to dominate global nuclear markets. Although the United States nuclear technology suppliers still have the most advanced, most innovative, and safest technologies, they do start at a disadvantage because they're competing against sovereign entities around the world. The US government support for nuclear suppliers, including a strong export credit agency in the United States Export-Import Bank, is essential. Let me conclude with a final thought. To preserve its ability to global use of nuclear technology, the United States must have both a strong domestic nuclear program and an aggressive nuclear trade and export program. The United States will simply not be seen as a credible global nuclear leader if we casually allow our current nuclear fleet to atrophy. All of this begins with a strong nuclear energy infrastructure right here at home. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir?
So when you're looking at the new construction, the biggest problem they seem to have is they can never get the costs under control. The 4 plants being built are way cost overruns, and I understand the contractor had a lot to do with it. Incompetence was the goal there, it seemed, and they met it. But going forward, what regulatory commission in what state would approve a company building a new plant except as an ironclad contract, and no contractor will give them one because they can't seem to get the costs in hand? What are you doing to kind of figure that whole thing out?
Yeah, thanks. So the question is, again, under the construction uncertainty, time and schedule, and of course money. I don't want to hazard a final guess for these plants that are under construction right now, but let me just give you a current data point. First of all, let's start with an appreciation that these, in fact, are being built now as first-of-a-kind investments, and I would say first-of-a-kind, any large infrastructure project, the kinds of challenges that you see on schedule, et cetera, is not unusual. But let's talk about these current ones, which we know have had some issues and some challenges, and look at the original business case that was made to the customers. And that original business case that was made to those customers, and look at, as they forecast what their end will be in the next few years, even with the schedule delays, even with the increase in cost, it's a better proposition to that customer than what was promised in the beginning. A better proposition, actually significantly. And why is that? Well, because when these projects were first approved, they assumed a certain cost of money, right? And if you look at what interest rates have been over the last several years, they've been much lower than you probably would have assumed they would have been when you put that business case together. So I would share with you that we really need these projects to finish, and let's see what those data points actually are. They're not across the finish line yet, so again, I'm not promising this. I'm simply saying that at the end of the day, they are still a very good business proposition and a better business proposition than was originally promised to the customer.
Hi. From a finance industry perspective, I watched the NOVA episode on nuclear power recently, and one thing that came to mind when you were talking is there's a lot of capital being invested in the existing nuclear fleet, and I understand why. But I also liked the beginning of your presentation where you talked about the future of nuclear, and I liked how NOVA talked about it. And I think the markets are very skeptical about the economic viability of existing nuclear plants. But I think there are a lot of things in the future that could be very attractive. So I guess my question is, as a country and as companies, we're putting a lot of capital into existing plants. How can we put more capital into developing new technology, which would make the U.S. a global leader? And I think it's probably a hard question, but I think that would be a way to get more excitement around nuclear.
Yeah, I agree. So the idea of the advanced nuclear or the nuclear of the future, if you will, there is a lot of interest. I would contrast the new nuclear of the future as compared to how nuclear evolved in the past. So the nuclear plants that we have today, if you look at how they were developed, there was heavy government engagement and involvement that really drove the commercialization of nuclear here in the United States. I see this second phase as really being driven by a bit of a different model. You're going to have the government involved in the R&D part of it, so I think the R&D and some of the resources from DOE are very critical and very important. But you're going to have heavier entrepreneurial spirit, I believe, and we're in fact seeing that today. I mentioned Bill Gates with his engagement and involvement. There's several others here in the United States that are in fact pulling together some of these interesting reactors of the future. And they're not all this really large 1,000 megawatt variety. You have some, we mentioned small modular reactors. They're in, say, the 50 megawatt variety. You have some folks that are interested in, say, 1 to 3 megawatt variety, and you'd say, my goodness, what would you do with that? Well, think about being in a very rural place, maybe in the middle of a desert someplace, and you had something that could give you a few megawatts, and you had to refuel it every, 20 years. Well, that's pretty attractive, right? And so I share with you that this entrepreneurial spirit that we're looking at isn't just coming up with large sort of standalone baseload plants. It's actually really a spectrum of things, and there's a lot of interest and engagement and enthusiasm right now in these advanced reactors. I think we need to encourage it. Again, we have to look at, in fact, DOE and the development that's being done. In some cases, we have our folks that want to try out some things, and we don't actually have the resources here in the United States for them to do that. They're going to other countries, in fact, to use a reactor that they have in another country because we don't have that here. That's the kind of infrastructure that I think it's important for DOE to own, right? We should have a fast reactor here that's ability for people to use in order to learn about materials, et cetera, in order for them to design these reactors of the future. You might have also heard recently of an initiative, it was called GAIN, in order to open up some of our national labs to these entrepreneurs so that they have the ability to use some of the resources that are available through DOE. And so that process is helping. But we're going to need, as you stated, this heavy capital investment. We're going to need to encourage that spend because that there is an outcome. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're producing something that the markets will value, and so we have to keep our eye on that cost, right? How expensive is some of this newer technology, and does it make sense? But I would just share with you, it's very exciting and it's very encouraging, the entrepreneurial spirit that is burgeoning here. That's why it's so important that we really focus on our fleet today, because it's the folks today that are going to say, what am I going to study? You know, am I going to go into nuclear engineering? Well, yeah, we need to encourage that pipeline so that we have the talent pool that's going to drive this innovation, that's going to, in fact, take us to the next place. So if we're not excited about the fleet that we have today, and if we don't value the fleet we have today, why do you think then the students and our children are going to go through this field of study? And it's so important that we become and stay that nuclear leader in technology. Yes, in the back?
Hey, good morning. Jeremiah Borum, UBS. Just wondering on the SMR front, we've heard that the permitting costs could be substantial. I'm wondering if you could comment on that, you know, even approaching kind of the $1 billion range for some of these new reactors. And you were saying kind of mid-2020 timeframe, I believe. Is that basically for, you know, seeing a project in the ground or getting it to the point where you could start to invest in it? Thank you.
Yeah. So a couple questions in there. From a small modular reactor perspective, as we talked earlier on an earlier question about the uncertainty around build and schedule and this kind of thing, one of the things that the SMRs really offer us is, being as that they're small and modular, it's a bit more of, I'll say, a factory setting, if you will, that these components can be made into. So I think we need to have a better view from a cost performance perspective of how much we think that that can improve the overall cost. The fact that they just submitted to the NRC wants roughly a 3-year time frame to review that design certification. But this company that's building SMRs already has a customer, so they are already focused on a build. So by the time they get that design certification from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and go through the licensing process and get into build, we imagine that we are talking in the mid-2020s. Yes, sir.
Hi, Joe Zhu from A1 Capital. I just follow up on the new nuclear. As you may already know, the Toshiba is talking about to exit the nuclear construction business after taking another relatively larger write-off in their nuclear business. So as the owner of Westinghouse, who is providing the crucial technology for Vogtle and Summer projects here in the US, that could create another layer of uncertainty of the new nuclear construction. So as how would NEI view this situation? How would NEI help? Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the question relative to Toshiba, obviously I'm not going to speak or conjecture on Toshiba or Westinghouse's behalf. I think you probably have already seen in the news that they intend to present some additional information end of next week. And then, of course, you'll have earnings information from the companies that are building in the weeks follow. So over the next several weeks, we're all going to get a little smarter of exactly the details for Toshiba. But what I will share as you get this information is, in fact, how do we look at nuclear plant construction? And when we say somebody's getting out of the construction business, what does that even mean? So from a construction, there's the engineering piece, there's the procurement piece, and there's the construction piece. And there's lots of companies that are involved in each piece. So when we talk about this construction piece and whether or not somebody wants to be or stay in the construction business, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not in the engineering business, and it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily in the procurement business. And if you think about the technology and what's pure to that technology, that's really this engineering piece, and that's really this procurement piece. And that's really at the essence, if you will, as we see these announcements coming out, there's lots of different companies that can get in that construction business as well. So again, I don't want to hazard a guess, but I didn't want the view to be that if you're not in the construction business, that we also don't have these other very significant businesses that can still be a part of. I'm sorry, yes, sir.
What's your view on the economic situation. What's your view on the Yucca Mountain situation now that President Trump is in, and I think he has a different view than the last guy?
Yeah, so the question is Yucca Mountain, so I'll share with you first just waste in general, used fuel in general in the nuclear industry. I guess I'll just reinforce that wherever it is stored, it's safe. Right now it's stored at the sites in which that used it, and so there's separate different facilities at each site, but there's nothing wrong, if you will. It's very safe where it is. The question on Yucca Mountain, as you know, over the last several years, it's been very difficult to have a conversation about spent fuel because we had some pretty strong political lines that were drawn. And with this new administration, we see the opportunity for that conversation now to play out. And so we expect, in fact, have already heard from some members of Congress that they're very interested to pursue their bills, once again, relative to storage of fuel. So there's the long-term depository, and that's Yucca Mountain, and then there's a school of thought on interim storage. So from an NEI perspective, we would actually like to see progress on both. We would like to see Yucca Mountain go forward through the licensing process to in fact try out and prove that that licensing process is sound and in fact that that facility is perfectly suitable. At the same token, as we look at, even if you started the progress on Yucca Mountain licensing today, it's still going to be several years into the future. With some of the plants that we see that are decommissioning, we think having an interim storage option to have the ability to store that while it's ultimately on its way to that long-term depository is in fact the right thing to do. So we're looking for progress on both, but as I shared, you're going to hear lots more conversation on the Hill over the next year or so, simply because you can. In the past, we really couldn't create a conversation on used fuel, and we have the ability now to have that conversation play out. Yes, ma'am?
Where do the AP1000 designs stand in China, and are there any new? Where do the AP1000 designs stand in China with Sanmen, and are there any new issues that have come up there that would impact the U.S. projects in Georgia and South Carolina?
Yeah, so the question being asked on the AP1000, which is the same design that we're building in Vogel and in Summer, is also under construction in Sanmen. And the last that I heard, in fact, that construction was going very well. And as we do in the nuclear industry, we share operating experience. And I know that some of our folks have been over to China to see the progress there, and again, apply those learnings to what it is that we're building here in the United States. But I think progress is proceeding well there. It's a little hard to see in the corner, so.
Hi. You mentioned Pennsylvania, Ohio, Connecticut, New Jersey as states for potential policy opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
I think Exelon mentioned the same states yesterday. Do you see, will legislation required to be passed in all those states, like Illinois, or will it be more like a New York situation where only the local utility commission is required?
Yeah, so he's bringing up a good point in terms of why was the difference between New York and Illinois, where New York was really a public service commission level discussion and Illinois was legislation. And what that shows you is that every state is different. And the reality is that in New York, that was not requiring legislation, whereas in Illinois, the same type of the decision did require legislation. So each state has its own specific rules. And I'm not going to go into specifics on each. There's a legislative path currently in Connecticut, so that one will definitely be through legislation. I believe we see it in a legislative path also in Pennsylvania. And I would say likewise in Ohio, that we're thinking that that would all go through more of a legislative path as opposed to just a public service commission decision. Yes, sir?
Hi, related question. Do you believe the ZECs will survive the legal and regulatory challenges that they're facing now, and why? And if they do you envision NEI and the industry to pursue a federal platform or program that's similar to the ZECs we're seeing at the state level? Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, obviously when the zero emission credits process went in, everybody sort of anticipated that lawsuits would be filed. So we took a very critical look at that when those were put in, and I know NEI on behalf of these companies has in fact filed in support of the companies as these are being challenged. So we do feel that in fact that they will survive. Of course, time will tell, and we'll have to see. But we do think that we have a good argument relative to them surviving these challenges. And you know, I would share that likewise, although the current administration may not have as strong views, say, on climate, as we look at the state policies and state levels, we think that the states are still very interested in sort of the clean air, energy, climate benefit that nuclear plants provide. And so we believe that that conversation at a state level will still play very strongly. In terms of would we put that in at a federal level, I used the word infrastructure quite a bit in the prepared remarks that I had, and I would share that we're really looking to connect nuclear and the current fleet with the critical electric infrastructure. And we would like to take a look at that as more the federal play. In other words, if it's valuable and critical electric infrastructure, then should we price that in at a federal level? Is that what we're looking to for FERC engagement and involvement? And so that's really what we're exploring now, is the connection at an infrastructure level and valuing it for the critical infrastructure support that it provides. Yes, sir.
The ZECs give some nice revenue support, obviously, but I know DOE has done some work. We don't ramp any of our fleet. France does, and I think DOE and maybe NEI has looked at some potentials for ramping a portion of our fleet as we deal with more intermittent resources. And if you had the combination of ZEC-like support and an ability to ramp, could you be a more flexible resource?
Yeah, so the question is ramping our nuclear assets up and down. We have done some of that in the Midwest. I know Exelon has taken that on for some of their fleets. It has to be in very obviously close coordination with the markets in terms of whether or not it's the right time to ramp up or ramp down. And as you said, France is in fact doing that with their plants. So we can do some of that. It's not as efficient as an operation, obviously, when you're ramping up and ramping down. But we do have the ability to do that. Again, it needs to be in very close coordination with the markets whenever you make those decisions. Okay, well, not seeing any more questions. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.